Hello everyone and welcome back to our channel. As you are all aware of, we were discussing about the urinary system. So let's move on to the other organs of the urinary system. Okay, apart from the kidneys, the other organs include the ureters, the urinary bladder and the urethra. Okay, so before going into the individual organs, let us just brief over the passage of the urine which is formed in the kidneys. So we all are aware that the nephrons are the structural as well as functional units of the kidneys, into which actually the urine formation begins. Okay, so as the fluid is filtered in the glomerular capsule, okay, in the renal corpuscles, so as it passes through the tubules, various processes of secretion and reabsorption will take place. Ultimately, urine formation takes place as the fluid passes through the collecting ducts. So this is the place where, or this is the part of the nephron where actually the regulation of the loss of water in the urine is also carried out with the help of the hormone ADH, that is antidiuretic hormone. Okay, so it will decide whether the dilute or the concentrated urine will be formed. Okay, so as the urine, it leaves the collecting duct, we have seen that it enters into the minor calyces. So from several minor calyces, it will join together and enter into the major calyces, and major calyces again will unite together to form a large space called as renal pelvis. So this is the last part into which the urine is drained within the kidney, and from here it will move out of the kidney and enter into the ureters. Okay, so these are the ureters which begin at the renal hilum. From here the urine will be carried towards the urinary bladder. Okay, so the main function of ureters is to convey the urine from the kidneys into the urinary bladder. Now since the formation of the urine, it's a continuous process. Okay, so there should be some organ which will store this urine temporarily before the excretion of the urine will take place. Okay, so this urinary bladder, it actually acts as the organ for temporary storage of the urine, and as the bladder becomes full, it is then emptied out and the urine will pass through the urethra towards the exterior. Okay, so let us consider all these three organs one by one. That is the ureters, urinary bladder and the urethra. So coming to the ureters. Okay, now as we have seen in the anatomy of the urinary system, the kidneys are paired organs, right? There are two kidneys. Okay, so similarly ureters are also paired in nature. So there are two ureters originating from each kidney. So this one is the right ureter and this one is the left ureter, originating from the respective kidneys. Okay, so it will help in transporting the urine which is produced by the kidneys, by the respective kidneys, towards the single urinary bladder. Okay, now what makes it possible for this urine to flow through the ureters? Why is it moving only towards this direction? Why it descends downwards towards the bladder? So that is made possible by the peristaltic contractions. Okay, remember the peristalsis which we had discussed in the GIT. So by the differential contraction of the differentially arranged smooth muscles in the walls, it makes it possible to propel the things along a tube like structure. So there is a differential arrangement of these smooth muscles. So if you can consider this is a tube like structure, so there are certain muscles which are placed longitudinally. Now longitudinally means along the length of this particular structure. So that is the longitudinally placed muscle. So in the wall these muscles are located, the smooth muscles, as you all must be aware of the shape of the smooth muscle. It is spindle shaped muscle, right? So these muscles are placed longitudinally, that is along the length of the tube like structure, or this may be also placed circularly. Okay, that is this way. So if this is your tube like structure, these muscles will be arranged circularly. So if you look through the tube like structure, these muscles are arranged in this particular fashion, right, this way along the wall of that particular tube like structure. Okay, so this is the differential arrangement of the smooth muscles, different layers of smooth muscles, which makes it possible for this peristaltic contractions to take place. Okay, so mainly it is the peristalsis, the waves of peristalsis which originate over here in the kidney, and they will travel along the walls of the ureters towards the urinary bladder. Okay, now apart from these peristaltic contractions, there are two more processes which are responsible for the movement of the urine. Okay, that is the hydrostatic pressure which is exerted by the urine. So that makes it possible for it to move in the forward direction, as well as the gravitational force. Okay, so here you can see that the ureters are descending downwards, right? So the gravity also pulls on the urine and helps in movement of the urine towards the urinary bladder. Okay, so these peristaltic waves mainly are responsible for the movement. Apart from that, hydrostatic and the gravitational force are also acting, but mainly it is the peristaltic waves which are responsible. Okay, so these peristaltic waves which originate into the renal pelvis, they travel towards the urinary bladder. Now the frequency at which these peristaltic waves are occurring, it varies. Okay, so there may be 1 to 5 peristaltic waves per minute which are responsible for propulsion of the urine towards the urinary bladder. Now again, this frequency may be variable depending upon how fast the urine is formed by the kidneys. So faster the urine is formed, more will be the peristaltic waves which are generated, so that the movement of urine which is formed in the kidneys towards the urinary bladder is faster. So more number of peristaltic waves will be produced. Okay, so this is to do with the movement of the urine along the ureters. Now coming to the anatomy of the ureters. So these ureters, they range from 25 to 30 centimeters in length. Okay, and they are thick-walled narrow tubes, okay, which are extending from the kidneys towards the urinary bladder, and their diameter is again variable. It is quite variable. It may vary from 1 mm to 10 mm. That is, as they travel along the cavity, okay, abdominopelvic cavity. So as you can see that the diameter doesn't remain the same, right? So as you can see, it is slightly more over here. The diameter is more as compared to this particular portion. Okay, so this is the distal portion, correct? If you can recall the terms proximal and the distal. What do you mean by distal? Something which is far away from the origin, right? So where are the ureters originating? Over here. So this is the site of origin of the ureters. So this particular portion will be proximal, right, because it is near to the origin, and this particular portion is the distal portion because it is away from the origin. Okay, so as you can see, the proximal portions, these are quite more in diameter, right, thickened, and the distal portions, these are quite less in diameter, right, size is smaller if you can compare the two. Okay, so as it moves towards the bladder, the diameter goes on reducing. Now coming to the location of these ureters. Okay, so ureters, as it extends downwards, but their location is retroperitoneal. Remember, the kidneys are also retroperitoneal. What do you mean by retroperitoneal? Yes, something which is located behind the peritoneum, right? Okay, so we have seen the different folds of the peritoneum when we have discussed the GIT, correct? So peritoneum, it forms different folds, it holds the different organs of the abdominal or abdominopelvic cavity. So it mostly forms the outer covering of the organs, and it is double layered structure. Now most of the visceral organs are covered by this peritoneum on all the sides, but that is not the case with the kidneys and the ureters. So there are certain organs in the abdominopelvic cavity which are located posterior to this peritoneum, that is, they are covered from by this peritoneum only from the front side, anteriorly. Okay, so they are located in between the peritoneum and the posterior wall of the abdomen. So these are called as retroperitoneal organs. So ureters are also retroperitoneal in nature. Okay, so as it descends downwards, okay, so it descends posterior to the bladder. Now this is a urinary bladder in males. Okay, as you can see, these are the ureters, right? So this is the posterior view. Okay, so the ureters, they descend downwards posteriorly. Okay, and at the base of the urinary bladder, they curve slightly. As you can see over here, they curve medially. Okay, so they are moving towards the midline of the urinary bladder, right, from both these sides. Okay, so they are forming a curve medially and they pass obliquely through the wall of the posterior aspects of the urinary bladder. So this is the posterior surface of the urinary bladder, right? So as you can see, at somewhere at this particular position, they are entering into the urinary bladder. Okay, so as you can see, this is the frontal plane. So you are looking at the bladder from front side now. So as you can see, both these ureters have descended down but posterior to the urinary bladder, and where they are opening into the urinary bladder, it's somewhere at the base of the urinary bladder. This is a urinary bladder, right? So where they are opening, this is the opening of the ureters, both the ureters, for right one and this is for left one. So as you can see that the opening is somewhere at the base of the urinary bladder. Now as this particular opening, it doesn't open into the bladder through the wall exactly horizontally, but how it is opening? It is opening obliquely. For example, I'm just trying to show this particular, the way by which it is opening into the urinary bladder, how it crosses the wall of the urinary bladder. Okay, so this is how it opens into the urinary bladder. The opening, it is oblique. Okay, it is not exactly perpendicular to the surface, but it is oblique, the opening of the ureters into the urinary bladder. Okay, now there should be some control over the flow of the urine from the ureters into the urinary bladder, right? So as we have seen that at different systems, there are some sphincters which are controlling the movement of the substances from one area into the next area. Say for example, there is LES, lower esophageal sphincter. So it guards the opening of esophagus into the stomach. Okay, so it controls the movement of food which you swallow from the esophagus into the stomach. Also there is a pyloric sphincter at the junction of the stomach and the small intestine. So it will control the movement of food from the stomach into the small intestine, right. So there are several types of valves or sphincters which are guarding the opening from one organ into the another organ, or one part to another part, right. So likewise over here, that is at the opening of ureters into the urinary bladder, there is as such no anatomical valve. Now how or what these valves are formed from? Usually these are the smooth muscles which act as the sphincters. So as they contract, they will close the opening. As they relax, they will increase the size of the opening so that the substance can move across. But that is not the case over here. Here there is no anatomical valve. Okay, so no such smooth muscles are present in this particular area, but there is a physiological valve which is present over here. Now what do you mean by this physiological valve? Now what is the role of this urinary bladder? Let us understand how it functions. Now the function of this urinary bladder is to store the urine, right. So whatever urine is produced by the kidneys, it will enter into the urinary bladder. So what will happen? As it is getting filled with the urine, it will get expanded, right. The size will go on increasing as more and more urine is filled over here. Now as this bladder is getting filled with the urine, the pressure inside the urinary bladder, it will increase. So because of this increased pressure and because of stretching of the walls of the bladder, what it will do is, it will result in compression of this oblique opening. As we have seen that the opening of the ureters, how is it? It is oblique, right. So as this bladder, it gets stretched due to more and more urine, what happens to these valve? So it will get closed automatically because it is obliquely placed, right. So as the wall of the bladder is getting stretched, it will compress on this oblique opening of the ureters into the urinary bladder, which is present over here at these 2 points. Okay, so for the convenience I have drawn it over here. Actually these are present over here. Okay, so because of these oblique openings, as the bladder expands, it will stretch and it will compress the oblique opening so that it will close off. So this arrangement or this particular opening, the type of opening which is present over here, it helps in prevention of the backflow of the urine into the ureters. Otherwise what will happen? If the valves are not functioning properly, what will happen? The urine which is present over here, it can flow backwards into the ureters because the pressure over here has increased now. Okay, so there are chances of microbes entering into the ureters in the backward direction. So the infection, the urinary tract infection, it can travel upwards and it can even get transferred to the kidneys as well. Okay. Now coming to the histology part. So let us see what exactly the walls of the ureters are composed of. Basically there are 3 layers which comprise of the mucosa, muscularis and the adventitia. Okay. So the deepest layer is known as the mucosa. So the one which is in contact with the urine actually. Okay. So if these are the ureters, okay. So this particular layer, inner layer, which is actually in contact with the urine, this is the lumen, right. So the one which is in contact with urine which is flowing through is known as the mucosa. So let us see what it is composed of. Okay, so it is made up of the mucous membrane. So mucous membrane, it comprises of the epithelial cells, right. So, what type of epithelial cells are present over here? Transitional epithelium. You all must be familiar about the types of epithelial tissue, right. So, different types of tissues you all must have studied. One of the type of tissue is epithelial tissue. So, based on the shape, the epithelial tissues can be classified into different types, right. So, flattened cells are known as squamous epithelial cells. The cube shaped cells are known as cuboidal epithelial cells, and the column shaped cells are known as columnar epithelial cells, right. So, depending upon the shape they are classified. Okay. Now, these transitional epithelium, what are these transitional epithelium? There is one more type of epithelium which changes the shape, which has the capability to switch in between these two shapes. Okay. So, usually it is cuboidal in shape, but as it stretches, it changes its shape to squamous epithelium. So, it becomes flattened, so it turns out into, or it will look like squamous epithelium, and when the stretching is relieved, it will gain the cuboidal shape back again. Okay. So, these type of epithelial cells which are capable of changing the shape are known as transitional epithelium. Okay. Now, why do you think this is present over here? Because the ureters, they are involved in the transportation of the urine. So, this volume may be variable, right. So, according to the volume, these walls, it may be stretchable to accommodate the variable amount of urine which is flowing through. Okay. And underlying this particular mucous membrane, there is a lamina propria. So, lamina propria, as you are all aware of, it is composed of areolar connective tissue. Apart from that, collagen, elastic fibers, and also lymphatic tissues will be present over here. Okay. So, the role of this particular mucosa, mainly the transitional epithelium, it helps in accommodation of variable volume of the urine which flows through. So, stretching will allow the ureters to change their diameter to accommodate the variable volume of urine which is flowing. Now, apart from these, the mucosa also comprises of the goblet cells. Now, what is the function of goblet cells? Yes, they produce the mucus. So, the mucus which is secreted by these goblet cells, it forms a protective layer over here. Now, through the lumen of this ureter, what is flowing? Urine is flowing, right. Now, what is the pH of urine? It is acidic in nature, right. So, the pH is acidic in nature. So, also the composition is also variable. It is not the same as that of your body fluids, right. So, it is variable. So, the fluid which is flowing through, it has a variable pH and the composition. It is different than what these cells which are lining these mucosa will be present, right. So, it may disturb the homeostasis of these cells, right. So, to avoid that, the goblet cells secrete mucus which is coating this mucosa. So, it prevents this mucosa from coming in contact with the urine. Okay. Then the second layer, the intermediate layer or the middle layer of the wall of the ureters, it is known as muscularis. So, as the name implies, muscularis, what it will be composed of? Yes, the smooth muscle fibers. Now, there are two layers of smooth muscles which are present over here. Okay. The inner layer comprises of the longitudinally placed smooth muscles, and the outer layer comprises of circularly placed smooth muscles. Okay. The layer which is close to the mucosa, the smooth muscles are placed longitudinally. We have seen what do you mean by longitudinal. And the outer layer, it is circular in nature. Now, if you can recall the muscularis of the gastrointestinal tract, the arrangement is exactly opposite. It comprises of inner circular layer and the outer longitudinal layer. But here it is inner longitudinal and the outer circular layer. Now, in the distal third part of the ureters, you know what do you mean by distal? Away from the origin. So, as if you divide these ureters into three parts, the distal part of the ureters, the muscularis in this particular part, it comprises of an additional layer of smooth muscle. Okay. So, usually it is inner longitudinal, outer circular, but in these particular regions the muscularis contains one more layer, that is outside this circular layer there is one more longitudinal layer of the smooth muscle fibers. Okay. So, muscularis in this particular region, it has three layers of the smooth muscle, the inner longitudinal, the middle circular and the outer longitudinal layer of the smooth muscle. So, what will be the function of this layer muscularis? Yes, it will help in the peristalsis, which is responsible for the movement of the urine, right? Okay. Then the superficial coat or the outermost layer of the ureters is known as adventitia. Okay. So, adventitia, it comprises of areolar connective tissue, okay, and also this particular layer, it will comprise of the blood vessels, the lymphatic vessels and the nerves which are actually supplying to the inner layers, that is muscularis and the mucosa. Okay. So, this adventitia actually it helps in anchoring the ureters to the neighboring organs and to help it remain in place. Okay, so, that is made possible by this layer adventitia. So, this is to do with the ureters. Coming to the next organ, that is the urinary bladder. Okay. So, from the kidneys, the ureters will carry the urine towards the urinary bladder. Okay. So, this urinary bladder, it is a hollow distendable muscular organ, okay, which is located in the pelvic cavity. So, it is located in the lower regions in the pelvic cavity. Okay. So, this is the diaphragm which divides the thoracic and the abdominopelvic cavity. So, this is the abdominal region, this particular region, and the lower region is known as the pelvic region. Okay. So, the pelvic cavity. Okay. So, the bladder, urinary bladder, it is located in the pelvic cavity, as you can see. Okay. This is the urinary bladder in the females. Okay. So, urinary bladder in both male as well as female, it is located posterior to the pubic symphysis. This is the pubic symphysis. Just posterior to that is located the urinary bladder. Okay. And in case of females, it is located anterior to the vagina. This is the vagina, okay, which extends from the uterus towards the exterior. That is the vagina. So, just anterior to that is located the urinary bladder and inferior to the uterus. Okay. So, what is the location of the urinary bladder in the females? Posterior to the pubic symphysis, anterior to the vagina and inferior to the uterus. Okay. And in case of males, it is located posterior to the pubic symphysis. This is the pubic symphysis and this is the urinary bladder. So, it is located posterior to the pubic symphysis and just anterior to the rectum. This is the rectum, last part of the gastrointestinal tract. So, in males, it is located directly anterior to the rectum, but in case of females, there is vagina, right, in between the rectum and the urinary bladder. So, it is just anterior to the vagina. Okay. And there are folds of peritoneum which holds the urinary bladder in position. Okay. Now, coming to the structural features of urinary bladder. Now, this bladder has a capacity of round about 700 to 800 ml. Okay. So, it can accommodate as good as 700 to 800 ml of urine. Okay. So, when this bladder, it accumulates a small amount of urine, it starts distending. So, it distends slightly due to accumulation of the urine. Okay. So, it attains a spherical shape. Okay. So, as you can see over here, slightly spherical in shape, right? And when it is empty, it will collapse. Okay. So, always some amount of urine will be present in the urinary bladder. Okay. So, when it is emptied, it collapses, and as the urine formation continues, again the urine will start accumulating over here and it will gain a slightly spherical shape. Now, as the volume of urine within the bladder over here, as it increases, the urinary bladder expands and it attains a pear shaped structure. Okay. So, it will extend into, now this is slightly spherical in shape, right. So, as it expands, it gains a pear shaped structure. So, it will start expanding into the abdominal cavity, which is just superior to the bladder. Bladder is located in the pelvic cavity, right. So, it will start extending into the abdominal cavity as more and more urine starts accumulating into the bladder. And in case of females, the urinary bladder, it is slightly smaller as compared to the males, because we have seen that just superior to the urinary bladder lies the, yes, the uterus, right, it is present over here. So, because of this, the size of the urinary bladder is slightly smaller in case of females. Okay. So, with this brief introduction, let us start with the anatomy and the histology of the urinary bladder. Okay. So, let us see what are the details of the urinary bladder. Okay. Now, as you can see, this is the frontal plane of the urinary bladder. Okay. Now, if you can see internally, this is the base of the urinary bladder, spherical shape, right. So, this is a base, and these are this is actually the posterior wall which is visible over here, and this is the superior wall of the bladder. Okay. Now, at the floor of the urinary bladder, you can see there is a triangular shaped structure which has a smooth appearance. Now, this small triangular area, it is known as the trigone. Trigone means triangle. Okay. Now, there are some anatomical structures, okay, which when joined together form this triangular shaped area. If you can see these are the openings of the ureters, right. Opening of right ureter, this is the opening of the left ureter. So, if you join these 2 points, it forms one side of the triangle, right. Whereas, the third point, that is the internal urethral orifice, which is the opening of the urinary bladder into the urethra, which is the next part. So, if you take these 3 points and if you join them together, it forms a triangular area, and that is known as a trigone. Okay. So, as you can see that the appearance is quite smooth, that is because the mucosa, it is firmly bound with the muscularis in this particular region. So, that is why it has a slightly smooth appearance. Otherwise, in rest of the area, as you can see that there are folds which are visible, right, and these are known as rugae. So, the mucosa in rest of the urinary bladder, this is present in terms of the folds. Remember rugae, this particular term we have come across where else? Which other organ or which system? Yes, that is in the stomach, right. There are rugae, folds which are present because it is distendable in nature. So, similarly, the urinary bladder is also distendable in nature. So, as the urine accumulates over here, the surface will become smooth. So, when it is empty, there will be folds of the mucosa which will be present over here, right. Okay. So, coming to the histology of the urinary bladder. So, let us talk about the wall of the urinary bladder now. Okay. Again, here it is made up of 3 layers: mucosa, muscularis, and the adventitia or the serosa, it is known as. Okay. So, the deepest layer is the mucosa, that is the innermost layer, this one, the one which is in contact with the urine which is present over here. So, that is mucosa. So, it will be composed of mucous membrane, and mucous membrane, it comprises of transitional epithelium. Okay. So, it is same as that of the ureters, right, and underlying to this mucous membrane is the lamina propria. Lamina propria comprises of areolar connective tissue. Apart from that, collagen will be present, elastic fibers will be present. So, composition is same as that of the ureters, of the mucosa. Coming to the second layer or the middle layer or intermediate layer is the muscularis. Okay, now this muscularis in the wall of the urinary bladder, it is also known as detrusor muscle. Now, why it is known as detrusor muscle? Meaning of detrusor is to push downward. That is because these muscles which are present in this layer, muscularis, it helps to push the urine downwards as it contracts. That is why it is known as detrusor muscle. So, this detrusor muscle or the muscularis layer, it comprises of 3 layers of smooth muscle fibers. These are arranged differentially, that is the inner longitudinal, middle circular and the outer longitudinal layers. Is it similar to the distal third of the ureters? The last part of the ureters also comprise of 3 layers, right, similar to this. Okay. Now, at the opening of the urinary bladder into the urethra, this muscles which are present in the muscularis at this particular region, okay, that is at the internal urethral orifice, opening of urinary bladder into the urethra, it is known as internal urethral orifice. So, at this particular region, the smooth muscles which are present over here, they form a sphincter called as internal urethral sphincter. Okay. So, it forms the internal urethral sphincter. So, what will be the role of this sphincter? Yes, to control the flow of urine from the urinary bladder into the urethra, which is the next part. Now, as you can see in the bracket, something is written involuntary. What do you mean by involuntary? Yes, something which is not under your control. You cannot make this sphincter to contract or relax, right. So, this flow of urine from the bladder into the urethra at this particular point, internal urethral orifice, that is not under your control. Why do you think it is? Yes, because these muscles are smooth muscles, right, which are not under your control. Okay, whereas inferior to this sphincter, there is one more sphincter which is located at this particular region. Okay, so that is known as the external urethral sphincter. Now, this particular sphincter, as you can see, it is present in the deep muscles of the perineum. These are the ones. So, these muscles, these are actually skeletal muscles which are located. So, skeletal muscles, are they under your control? Yes. That is the reason why this external urethral sphincter, it is voluntary in nature. So, you can make this sphincter to contract or relax. So, this is the reason why you can control the passage of urine. To certain extent you can control it, right. Okay, so that is made possible because of this external urethral sphincter, because it is composed of the skeletal muscles. Then coming to the superficial layer, the outermost layer of the urinary bladder. Now, this outermost layer, it is differential in different areas of the urinary bladder. In the posterior and inferior surfaces, it is known as adventitia. So, it will be composed of areolar connective tissue in this region, posterior region and the inferior regions. Okay, so, it is in continuation with the ureters. Okay, but in the superior aspects, As you can see, this particular layer, it is a layer of peritoneum, right? So it is known as serosa, so which is a part of visceral peritoneum. Okay, so this to do with the anatomy and the histology of the urinary bladder. Now before moving to the urethra, let us discuss about the micturition reflex. Okay, now what do you mean by this term micturition? Okay, micturition, which is also known as urination or voiding. So this is the discharge of urine from the urinary bladder. That is a passage of urine towards the exterior. So that act of movement of urine out of the urinary bladder towards exterior is known as micturition or urination, or it is also known as voiding. Now micturition, it occurs due to the combination of involuntary and voluntary muscle contraction. So there are certain voluntary and involuntary muscles which will contract and make it possible for the micturition to occur, or emptying of the urinary bladder will take place. Okay. So when this particular act will occur, act of micturition, what is controlling this micturition? So when the urinary bladder, it is distended due to accumulation of the urine. Okay. So as we have seen earlier, what is the capacity of the urinary bladder? Yes, it is 700 to 800 ml. This is the capacity of the urinary bladder, right? But as the volume of the urine within this urinary bladder, as it exceeds 200 to 400 ml, the pressure within the bladder will go on increasing, and this increase in the pressure, it is sensed by the stretch receptors which are present in the walls of the urinary bladder. Remember, these are the wall of the urinary bladder, it is supplied by the nerves, right? So certain nerves will act as the stretch receptors. So these are nothing but the sensory receptors which sense the stretching of the wall of the urinary bladder. So the nerve impulses will be generated and these will be transmitted towards the spinal cord. Remember this particular picture which depicts the different types of spinal nerves, right? So this is your spinal cord, and from here originates a number of spinal nerves, right? So these leave the spinal cord through the foramina in between the vertebrae, right? Intervertebral foramina. Okay, so accordingly these are named as per the vertebra through which they are leaving the spinal cord. So these are the C1, C2, C3, C4. So what does this C indicate? Cervical vertebra. Okay, so these are the different segments of the spinal nerves, as you can see. So for convenience, these are named as we have seen earlier. So T indicates thoracic. So because these are leaving the cord at the thoracic vertebrae. Next will be lumbar, because these are leaving the spinal cord from the lumbar region, and the last one are the sacral segments. So these are actually leaving the column. Actual column ends over here, but it is leaving from the sacral region. So as you can see that the impulses which are generated in the bladder also will be located somewhere over here, right? So the impulses are carried towards the spinal cord through S2 and S3. Okay, so these are the two segments at which the signals will enter into the spinal cord and it will trigger a spinal reflex. Remember the reflexes which we have seen? So there are certain cranial reflexes and certain spinal reflexes. Actually the spinal reflexes do not involve the brain as the processor, right? So whatever signals, these are processed at the spinal level, and from here the output is given. So actual center where the processing takes place is the spinal cord. So the impulses will travel towards the spinal cord and a reflex arc is formed, that is processing will take place and it will send the impulses back to form a reflex arc. So, it will involve the parasympathetic system. So, actually the output which is carried by these particular neurons, these actually belong to the parasympathetic system. So, these impulses which are originating from the micturition center, which is located in the spinal cord, these will be traveled towards the urinary bladder wall and the internal urethral sphincter. Okay. So, as a result of this, what will happen? So, the impulses will cause the contraction of the detrusor muscle. So, these will contract, which are located over here, and what will happen to this sphincter? Internal urethral sphincter, what will happen? It will relax. So, as a result of relaxation, this opening, that is the internal urethral orifice, it will increase and flow of urine will take place. Okay. So, upon contraction of these muscles in the wall of the urinary bladder and relaxation of the sphincter, voiding will take place or urination or micturition will take place. Now, actually this is a reflex, right? So, it is actually coordinated at the spinal level, but even before this reflex is actually occurring, a sense of fullness is produced in the brain. Okay. So, it initiates a conscious desire to urinate even before this micturition reflex occurs. It is not involuntary, right? To a certain extent you can control the micturition, right? That is because the sense of fullness, this particular sensation reaches your brain and you come to know that the bladder is getting filled. So, although the emptying of the urinary bladder, it is a reflex, okay, in early childhood you learn to control it. Okay, so, you learn to initiate or stop this particular reflex voluntarily. Now, what makes it possible? That is the external urethral sphincter, because these are voluntary in nature, right. So, the cerebral cortex, it can either initiate micturition or it can even delay the occurrence of the micturition reflex. Though it is a reflex, it is under voluntary control. Okay. So, small babies, okay, they are not able to tell you, right. Okay. But as the child grows, it learns to control this particular process of micturition. Okay. But sometimes it happens that nocturnal micturition may take place, okay, wherein the control over the bladder may be lost, or due to the problems with the sphincters also involuntary passage of the urine may take place. Okay. Now, this is to do with the urinary bladder. Coming to the next part, that is the urethra. Okay. So, from the urinary bladder, the urine passes into the urethra. Okay. So, this is the terminal part of the urinary system. So, urethra, a single urethra, which is a small tube like structure, okay, which is leading from the internal urethral orifice. So, that is the opening of the urinary bladder into the urethra, that is the internal urethral orifice. So, the urethra begins at this particular point towards the exterior of the body, and that particular portion is known as the external urethral orifice. Okay. Now, in both the male as well as female, it forms a passageway for the discharge of the urine out of the body, okay, and it forms the terminal portion. But in case of males, it is also involved in discharge of the semen. So, it is actually the part of reproductive system as well in case of males. So, it helps in discharge of the semen which contains the sperms. Okay. Now, as you can see, the structure of the urine or the size of the urine, it is quite variable. So, this is in case of females, it is originating over here, and that is the external urethral orifice. So, it is quite short, right, in case of females, whereas in case of males it extends from here. This is your internal urethral orifice, okay, and this is the urethra, and that is the external urethral orifice. Okay. Now, coming to the urethra in case of females. So, we will discuss the urethra in detail separately in case of females and males, because there are some differences. Okay. So, in case of females, the urethra, it lies directly posterior to the pubic symphysis, right. This is the pubic symphysis, just posterior to that lies the urethra, and it is just 4 centimeter and is directed oblique. As you can see, it is directed obliquely, inferiorly and anteriorly. This is the anterior part, right. So, as you can see, it is oblique, extending inferior and anteriorly, and it is just 4 centimeters in length, and the opening towards the exterior, it is known as external urethral orifice. So, this is located just in between the clitoris. This is the clitoris and the vaginal opening. This is the vagina, right. It is extending from the uterus towards the exterior. So, just anterior to the vaginal opening lies the external urethral orifice. Okay. Now, coming to the wall of the urethra. So, it comprises of 2 layers, that is a deeper layer known as mucosa, and the superficial layer is called as muscularis. Now, coming to the mucosa, obviously what it will be composed of? Mucous membrane comprising of the epithelium and the lamina propria. Lamina propria will be comprised of areolar connective tissue along with the elastic fibers and the plexus of veins. And the muscularis, it comprises of smooth muscles. So, these are arranged circularly. Now, there is only one layer, okay, of the smooth muscles which comprising of only circularly placed smooth muscle fibers. That is continuation with the urinary bladder. Okay. Now, coming to the epithelial cells. Okay. Now, in the mucosa, the epithelial cells are quite differential. Okay. Now, near the urinary bladder, now this is the urethra, right. So, just near the urinary bladder in this particular portion, the type of epithelium which is present is transitional epithelium, same as that of the urinary bladder, right. And just near the external urethral orifice, that is in this region, the type of epithelial cells, these are non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelial cells. So, these are the 2 terminal portions, right, and in between these 2 regions, the epithelium which is present in the mucosa, it is either stratified columnar or pseudo stratified columnar epithelium. Okay. Stratified means what? Multiple layers are present. And what do you mean by pseudo stratified? The differential heights of the columns makes it it gives it a stratified appearance, as if there are multiple layers which are present. Okay. So, this to do with the urethra in females, whereas in case of males it is quite different, right, as we have seen the length is more. The urethra, even here it extends from the internal urethral orifice, which is the opening of the urinary bladder into the urethra. So, that is the internal urethral orifice. So, it will extend up to the external urethral orifice. Okay. But the passageway is different and the length is also quite long. As you can see that it is 20 centimeters in length, and also it passes through different structures. Say it passes through the prostate, which is one of the accessory glands. It also passes through the deep muscles of perineum, and finally it passes through the penis. Okay, so this is the prostate gland through which the urethra is passing. From here it passes through the deep muscles of perineum, and then it continues through the penis. Okay, so accordingly the urethra can be anatomically divided into 3 regions. Okay, actually the wall, it comprises of the same 2 layers, mucosa and the muscularis, as we have seen in case of females. But the urethra is quite long, and as it passes through different structures, it is known differentially. Say for example, prostatic urethra is the first part. This is the one. This is the one. Why it is known as prostatic urethra? That's because it is passing through the prostate, right? That's why it is known as prostatic urethra. The second one is membranous urethra or intermediate urethra. Okay, this is the one. This is the one. This region, the shortest region, that is known as the membranous urethra, because it passes through the deep muscles of perineum. And the final part, which is the longest part, this is the one. So that is known as the spongy urethra, and it passes through the penis. This is the penis. Okay, this particular organ. Okay, so as it passes through the penis, it is known as the spongy urethra. Okay, now coming to the mucosa. So mucosa, it will comprise of the epithelial tissue, then the underlying lamina propria will be present, and the epithelium, which is present in different regions of the urethra, it is variable. Say for example, the epithelium in the prostatic urethra. What do you mean by prostatic urethra? The first part which passes through the prostate. Okay, so it comprises of the transitional epithelium. Okay, just near to the bladder, it comprises of transitional epithelium that slowly becomes stratified columnar or pseudo stratified columnar epithelium. Okay, so as it moves further, then the mucosa of the membranous urethra, it comprises, that is over here, it comprises of the stratified columnar or pseudo stratified columnar epithelium, same as these, right? Okay, and the epithelium in case of spongy urethra, which passes through the penis, it comprises of stratified columnar and pseudo stratified columnar epithelium along most of the length, excepting near the external urethral orifice. So in this particular region, the epithelium comprises of non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. Okay, so as you can see that the type of epithelial cells is varying. Near the bladder, it is transitional epithelium. So as you move further, it comprises of stratified columnar or pseudo stratified columnar epithelium, and as you move towards last part, it comprises of non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. And as discussed earlier, lamina propria, it comprises of areolar connective tissue along with elastic fibers and plexus of the veins. Okay, now coming to the second layer, the outer layer, it is known as muscularis. Okay, so muscularis means it will comprise of the smooth muscle. So mostly it is the circularly placed smooth muscle fibers which are present, okay, in this particular region. Okay, so it will help in formation of the internal urethral sphincter. Okay, just in this particular region, the smooth muscles which are located over here, they will form the internal urethral sphincter, which will control the movement of urine out of the urinary bladder. Okay, whereas the muscularis of the membranous urethra, that is the second part over here. So here the muscle fibers which are present in the muscularis, these are skeletal muscle fibers. So what they will form? Yes, they will form the external urethral sphincter. Okay, so since it is made up of skeletal muscles, so it is voluntary in nature, right? Okay. Now, apart from this, there are several glands and other structures which actually belong to the reproductive system. So, they will deliver their contents into the urethra. As you can see, this is the urethra, right, originating from the bladder, but as it is traveling, there are some more openings, right, into it. So, likewise, there are different ducts which open into the urethra. So, coming to the first part, that is the prostatic urethra, it contains the openings of the ducts which transport the secretions of the prostate. It is passing through prostatic gland, right, prostate. So, there are certain ducts which secrete the secretions of the prostate into the urethra. Apart from that, there is one more opening from the seminal vesicles, that also opens into the urethra. Opening of the ductus deferens or the vas deferens, this is the vas deferens. So, that also opens into the urethra, right. Vas deferens is the one which will carry the sperm which are produced by the testes. So, it will carry into the urethra. So, it will provide the secretions which are alkaline in nature, help in neutralizing the acidity of the female reproductive tract. So, also it will help in motility and viability of the sperm. So, we will be discussing all this in detail under the reproductive system. Apart from that, in the spongy urethra, there are openings of the ducts of bulbourethral glands or Cooper's gland, these are known as. So, they will empty their secretions which are alkaline in nature. So, they will also help in neutralizing the acidity of the urethra. So, also they produce the mucus which lubricates the end of the penis during the sexual intercourse. Apart from that, there are also ducts of the urethral glands or the litter glands which discharge the mucus into the urethra, okay, mainly into the spongy urethra. So, this also helps in the lubrication, okay, during the sexual arousal or the ejaculation. Okay. So, especially it is released during the sexual intercourse. Okay. So, this is to do with the ureters, urinary bladder and the urethra. So, also we have discussed the micturition reflex in detail. Okay. So, this is the reference. Thank you for watching.